Chapter 11, Accountability and Ethics, Part 1. Your textbook outlines two different ways to generally control police behavior. These are oversights, and so control of the police, and developing standards. So first of all, oversight. Oversight means that we can try to track behavior, we can correct it, we can punish it. So in essence, we supervise police officers. We are able to watch what they're able to do either directly, if we're a supervisor, through fellow police officers, through such things as body cams or video cams, through reports from the public. These can include complaints. A variety of different ways that we can provide oversight. So one way that we use the oversight function is to track, correct, or punish behavior. So we, again, track it by trying to watch it. We try to train the officers when we find out that they're doing something wrong. We try to correct them. And if necessary, we may need to punish the officers if the discipline is serious enough or if the corrections don't cause the police officers to change their behaviors. Some of the internal oversight mechanisms are early warning systems. We'll learn more about those as we progress through this PowerPoint and the other PowerPoints. For now, there are systems that are set up to identify problematic behavior or problematic officers. There are also departmental investigations. So if we suspect that some of our police officers are doing something wrong, we can conduct our own investigations. Usually that's through the internal affairs unit of the police. And then there's also management, so general management. The supervisor watching their subordinates, and when they identify that the subordinates are doing something wrong, they will correct them, they will take action to change that behavior. So this would be the general management function. And if you recall, we talked about management, different management styles, several chapters ago. There are also external oversight mechanisms. So these are mechanisms that are outside the department. So internal is within the department, external is outside. So the external, and these are just a few of the external mechanisms, oversight mechanisms, but they include such things as citizen review. So we have a board of citizens who will review complaints against police officers, maybe even sometimes the practices of the police department generally, even without a formal complaint, but usually they're involved in the complaint process. So a citizen files a complaint and the citizen review board investigates it, determines whether it's a valid complaint or not. External auditing is another form of external oversight. So what we mean by external auditing is there are different auditing agencies that are becoming more common. And what they do is they don't really deal with individual complaints, but what they deal with are the general practices of a police department. And so they will perform an audit to see if the police department is actually up to par. Are they actually doing what we expect them to be doing? Do they have the appropriate training, the appropriate supervision, the appropriate policies, etc., 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 that we would expect of a modern professional police department? And then finally, another form of external oversight would be legal remedies. So lawsuits, either brought by private citizens, by groups, or by government agencies against the police. So these are another mechanism to compel change, to increase the oversight of police officers. The legal remedies are in essence another watchdog over police behavior. The second way to control police behavior, so first we have oversight, second we have standards. So the second major way would be the development of standards for police departments and for police officers. So as policing has continued to mature, we see that there are more and more professional and ethical standards that are developed. So official codes of ethics, codes of professional responsibility. We see that with other professions. I have a law degree. I'm a licensed member of a state bar, and so I am bound to live up to professional expectations, professional ethical standards. Otherwise, I could lose my license. Well, policing doesn't have exactly that same kind of thing, but we are developing more and more professional standards for police officers, as well as ethical standards, and we're trying to teach them these in the police academy and then throughout their career. And we try to develop policies that actually reflect these professional standards. Right behavior. So, the police, as we talked about in an earlier chapter, the police will develop a culture. So do we have a culture in our police department that is honest, that is professional, that is service-oriented, etc., etc., etc. So do we have right behavior? Do we have respect for citizens' rights? Do we respect the Constitution? Do we respect the law? And so on and so forth. So right behavior is another form of standard, and is a way to control police behavior. Peer pressure will encourage police to behave in the appropriate way. Now, obviously, we might have wrong behavior in our police department, and that would cause police to behave in the incorrect way. So if we take some of those, if you recall, we were just talking about internal and external mechanisms. If we take a look at those, we can see with internal accountability mechanisms, so these are within the department ways that we can hold police accountable. And so one of the broad ways is through just the bureaucracy that it is a police department. So through this bureaucratic operation and management, as your book calls it, we can have written directives. So these are policies that are in the policy manual. So we actually write out what the policy is. So what is our policy on high-speed chases? When are the police allowed to engage in a high-speed chase? When are they not? So we've taken some of the decision making away from the police officer, and we put it in a written directive, so a written policy. And so we probably have a standard operating procedure manual somewhere in our department, and maybe it's online, maybe it's in an actual book, but the police officers have access to it and can understand what are the general policies and even specific policy of the police department. We can also have internal investigations. So the investigative process involves, if there's a complaint, that initiates a whole process. So the police officers have due process rights. And so the departments will respect these, and some of these rights are compelled by court decisions, such as the first one we see here, the Garrity interview. And what that refers to is if there's a complaint that's filed and we decide to follow through on the investigation. So we do an initial investigation to see if there's any merit to the complaint, and if there is, we're going to proceed further. And that may include bringing the officer in and interviewing that officer. Well, that officer, because this isn't a criminal investigation, doesn't have a right to remain silent. However, could develop into a criminal investigation. So if they reveal that they did do some criminal things, then that can obviously put them in jeopardy of a criminal prosecution. So what the Supreme Court said in a case by the name of Garrity is that when police are compelled to talk to investigators during a complaint investigation, if they're compelled during that investigation to talk and to tell the truth, so they can't say, I'm going to take the Fifth Amendment and remain silent, then the Garrity case essentially provides a Fifth Amendment type protection. It's not officially the Fifth Amendment, but what the Supreme Court said is if you're going to force a police officer to actually provide information against themselves, and it could potentially be criminal, that information cannot be used against the officer at trial. So you can use other evidence, but you can't use that officer's testimony during the complaint investigation in any criminal trial, at a criminal trial at a later time. So if you have to if you're compelled to talk to the investigators, that information that you reveal during the investigation basically gives you protection against that particular evidence. If there's a criminal prosecution later and they have evidence from independent sources other than your testimony during this complaint process, they can use that. The prosecutor can use that, but they can't use your words against you in essence. When there's an internal investigation conducted, and again, it's usually by, in most police departments, at least bigger police departments, it's by the internal affairs unit. When that investigation is completed, there are a variety of different outcomes that are possible. The one that's the worst for the police officers are sustained complaints. So a sustained complaint, if I can say it, a sustained complaint is a complaint that's found to be true. So a citizen makes a complaint against a police officer, it's investigated, and the Internal Affairs Unit, or maybe the Civilian Review Board, or whoever it may be, who decides the outcome of the complaint, they determine that it's true, that the police officer actually did do something wrong. The next kind of outcome, so the first one, sustained, means in essence the police officer is guilty of engaging in improper behavior, engaging in misconduct. So a sustained complaint again goes against the police officer. If the complaint comes back sustained, they can be punished. It can be anything from just a written note in their file to, or even a verbal warning, all the way up to, we're going to fire you and we're going to bring charges against you. So it could have a variety of different outcomes. But the next one that we see here, unsubstantiated complaint, it and the two other outcomes that we're going to examine in a second, all will result in the police officer not being punished. So sustained complaints will result in the police officer being punished. These next three outcomes will not. So an unsubstantiated complaint is simply the fact finder who's ever deciding this complaint just doesn't have enough evidence to make a decision. So maybe some citizen called up, the police department has a phone-in complaint system. Somebody called up and said, hey, Officer Schmo punched me. So Officer Schmo punched me, and click, they hang up. And we don't have a number that we can trace back. They didn't leave their name. They didn't leave any more information than Officer Schmo punched me. Well, we'll try to do a little bit of investigation, but it's unlikely we're going to be able to determine if the officer actually did do anything wrong, because there wasn't enough evidence. There just wasn't enough. And so this is what we call an unsubstantiated complaint. We're not saying that it isn't true. We're just saying we don't know if it's true or false. There just isn't enough evidence. This differs from an unfounded complaint. An unfounded complaint is essentially like a not guilty verdict, because what we're saying is there is enough evidence to make a decision, and based on that evidence we say the complaint is not true. So I know some state troopers who said when they first got cruiser cams, sometimes people would come in and complain and say, Trooper so-and-so really talked in an offensive way to me. And so the sergeant would then say, okay, well, let's pull the video cam hard drive and let's take a look. And because the citizen didn't realize that there was a cruiser cam filming everything, recording everything, they were a little surprised when they heard that there was one. And suddenly they might start saying, well, no, I don't want to make a complaint. And so they would withdraw it because they were lying. And so this is what we have with an unfounded complaint. It's not necessarily that the citizen is lying, but the complaint is just not true. And so the officer is found not guilty. The officer is not going to be punished. The last kind of complaint outcome would be exoneration. And so here's where what we're saying here is the facts of the complaint the basic facts were true. but the officer was justified in doing what the officer did. So let me give you an example. Maybe a citizen comes into the police department to make a complaint, then the citizen says, "Officer so-and-so hit me." And so when we do an investigation, we find out, in fact, that officer so-and-so did hit the citizen. But what the citizen left out was officer so-and-so hit the citizen after the citizen took 2 or 3 swings at the police officer. So the police officer was acting in self-defense. So yes, the officer did hit the citizen, but it was only because they were acting in self-defense. So they're exonerated. They're not going to be found guilty in essence, and they're not going to be punished. Now, some other internal accountability mechanisms: internal affairs, the internal investigation will be often turned over to internal affairs. This is a unit within the police department that investigates wrongdoing by police officers. Internal affairs units can be good or bad depending on different characteristics, because some are really determined and they're the ones who are going to go out and they will do a very thorough investigation and will have the ability to investigate fully and make findings. Other internal affairs units may be compromised, meaning the police chief or some other supervisor has a lot of control over them and can tell them where to look and where not to look. And so their investigation might not be so professional, and they may not be so diligent. They may be really there to make things look good for the police department and sweep things under the rug if necessary. So the first question is, are they really independent? Do they have adequate resources? So are they independent? Are they free to conduct a full and thorough investigation apart from any kind of influence? Adequate resources means, do they actually have the resources to do their job? Or, are they given an old beat up police car and maybe a pair of binoculars and that's it? They don't have any other kind of resources to actually fully conduct an investigation. Do they have departmental support? And this isn't influence, but this is support. Does the chief really want the internal affairs unit to do their job? I want you to investigate this to the ends of the earth if necessary, and I will support you completely. That's different than, hey, don't find too much. Let's keep the scandals out of the newspapers. We also can have early warning identification systems. Again, these are systems that are really based on the idea that a small number of police officers commit a disproportionate share of bad behavior. And so if there are going to be complaints, the complaints aren't going to be spread across the whole police department and affecting everybody equally. It may be that a few police officers are responsible for the majority, if not a majority, a disproportionate share of the complaints. And so what these early warning systems do and identification systems do is, through either computer software or through some other mechanism, they try to identify officers who have a higher than usual number of complaints filed against them, or a higher than usual number of problematic behaviors. And so when the red flag goes up and the police officer is identified, then that means it's time to investigate this officer more fully. And that's what early warning, early identification systems are really based on. If we don't have groups of officers committing these offenses over and over again, then these kinds of systems don't work so well. But if we're in a department where there are a disproportionate number of officers, or a particular number of officers who have a disproportionate number of complaints, then these systems may work better. Other forms of internal accountability: body-worn cameras. So again, more eyes on the police to see what they're actually doing. So it's not just their word against. Some external accountability mechanisms, we mentioned civilian review boards are sometimes used. They investigate individual complaints. So a citizen files a complaint, civilian review board investigates it. So we have a group of civilians that are outside the control of the police. Police departments don't like civilian review boards because, unlike internal affairs, there is no control over civilian review boards by the police. So they do have more independence. Question is, do they really have sufficient expertise? So who's sitting on the civilian review board? Do they actually understand police work at least a little bit? So they're not police officers, but do they understand police work? Can they understand the basics of use of force or criminal procedure or any of these other things? Because we need them to have some expertise so that they can look at what's happening and make a decision based on that expertise whether the police officers acted improperly or not. Do they have sufficient detachment, or have they gone native? They're outside the control of the police department, but over the course of time, because they're constantly working with the police, whereas the citizens are different in almost every case, there may be a tendency to start becoming friends with the police. And so if you go native, so to speak, if you start taking on the identity and the morals, the mores, and the culture of the agency you're investigating, then you've gone native and you're no longer objective. So this can happen as well. Do they have sufficient authority and support? Can they really do their job? Are they really well funded? Or are they really just there for show? Police auditor systems are another form of external accountability mechanisms. These are gaining in popularity. Unlike civilian review, these outsiders don't focus on individual complaints. They focus on general departmental procedures and whether the department is up to the state of the art in terms of training, policies, practices, etc., etc., etc. Police accreditation is becoming more common too. This is where agencies like CALEA, so this is probably the best known of the accreditation agencies, they will come into a police department and they will review the police department's practices, policies. In essence, they'll conduct an audit, but what their job is to eventually, if the police department is up to standards, and this is really a long and involved process. The university police, Penn State University Police, just went through accreditation just a couple years ago, and it was a major task for them because there was a lot of paperwork, a lot of review, a lot of time, all those kinds of things. But they eventually got certified. And you might wonder, well, why would an agency want to go through this? Well, for one thing, it shows everyone that you are right there exercising all the standards that are expected of a professional police department. And so it can obviously along the way identify any problem areas for you so that you can fix them. But if you receive accreditation, that means that you've fixed them. You are up to the proper standards of professionalism in the field. And so where can that be helpful? Well, it can be helpful in terms of insurance. Every municipality has to have insurance, or they have insurance. So that if they're sued, then the insurance company will pay the damages, will pay the money out. You can get better rates from insurance agencies if your police department is accredited. Because in essence, this accrediting agency like CALEA has gone in, really gone through everything in the police department, and at the end of the day, if they gave them an accreditation and said you are a professional police department in essence, then what you're saying is they're doing everything within their power to make sure the police act professionally, and therefore it's less likely they're going to be sued because it's less likely that they're going to engage in misconduct. So you have police departments willingly going through accreditation because, one, it helps their reputation, but two, it lowers their insurance